We're doing the data of HDI. So our first pair variable is the earning for male and earning for female annually. And the first graph we did is a scatter plot. And from this plot, we don't see a really strong relationship, and the plots are really scattered. And we think it's really hard to see if there's a direct relationship between the two variables. But then we put a trend line on the scatter plot, and so because of the trend line, we can see more clearly of what kind of relationship they have. And we still don't think the relationship is strong. They don't affect each other a lot, but we do see that at the beginning, as the female earns more, the male earns less. But as the graph develops, we can see the more the female earns, the more the male earns. So for the next plot, we did a box plot for the earning of female annually. And we can see that, and the plots are categorized by region. And we can see that female from Midwest earns the least, and female from the South earns the most. And the following graph is a box plot for the earning for male. And we can see that male earns the most from Northeast region, and is actually far exceed the other regions. And male from the South earns the least, which is really the opposite of the females, and based on the median. But if we look at the maximum wage for male, it's actually the least for the male from Midwest. And the following graph is a histogram. And this is for the earning of male. And from this graph, we can see the highest is this column. And we can see that most of the male earns annually around 32,000 US dollars. And there's very few that earns either below 30,000 or exceed the number of $3,750. So, and then we did a histogram for the earning of female. We can see this one is significantly high, which is the most for female salaries, is annually around 22,000, which is lower than the average annual wage for the male. And there's very few that earns below either 22,000 or exceed 30,000. So from comparing the two histogram chart, we can see that male definitely earns more than female, and there's a clear gap between the two gender. And here's a summary of our data. That's a mean, a minimum, that's a median, and that's a maximum. So for the second pair of data, we did the annual cost for 4-year public school and 4-year private school. So for the first graph, we did a scatter plot, and from the plot, we can see that all the dots are gradually going upward, and we assume that there should be a relationship. And then for the second graph, we add a trend line, and we do see that the line is actually positive slope, is going upward. And we think it's reasonable because we know that annually the school's tuition increases annually, so it should be going upward. And then for the following graph, we did a box plot for the annual cost of 4-year public schools. And from the box plot, we can see that the public schools from Mid-Atlantic cost the most, and the public school from South Atlantic cost the least. But if you look at the minimum, the public school from the mountain actually has the smallest minimum. And the whole box plot is categorized by division. And for the following plot, we did it for the private schools. And we can see that the private school from the New England costs the most, and the private school from the mountain costs the least. And then we did a histogram for the annual cost of 4-year private schools. And from the histogram, we can see that the mode for the cost of private school is around $24,000. And the private school that costs around $30,000 and $40,000 are not very little, but less than those of private school that cost $24,000. And then the following graph, we did the histogram for annual cost of four-year public school. And we can see that the annual cost of four-year public school is around $1,2,500. And the rest of the costs are pretty balanced and very similar. And here's a summary of our minimum, median, and maximum.
Our third pair of variable is suicide rate and rape rate. And the first visualization we did is a scatter plot for rape rate and suicide rate. And from this scatter plot, we can see that there is a fairly direct relationship between the two variables. And we can see that the higher the rape rate, the higher the suicide rate. The second visualization we did is also a scatter plot, but with a trend line. And we found that by using the trend line, we can be more sure that the rape rate and the suicide rate directly influence each other. And the higher the rape rate, the higher the suicide rate. The next visualization we did is a box plot for rape rate, and it's categorized by region. And from this box plot, we can see that the rape rate is the highest at Midwest and the lowest at Northeast. This is a box plot for suicide rate, and it's also categorized by region. And from this box plot, we can see that the suicide rate is the highest at West and the lowest at Northeast. We think that this is reasonable because the suicide rate is the second highest for the region Midwest, and we think that even though the suicide rate for Midwest is not the highest like the rape rate, we think that it's close enough to explain the relationship between rape rate and suicide rate, since it's the second highest and the lowest rate region matches for the two box plot. And the next visualization we did is a histogram for rape rate. And from this histogram, we can see that the mode of rape rate is around 26%, and there are very few that is above 60 and below 20%. And this is another histogram for suicide rate, and from this histogram we can see that the mode of suicide rate is around 11.5%, and the second highest is around 14%, and the third highest is around 17.5%. We think that for the rest of the rates, they are distributed in a fairly even way. And here is the summary of the minimum and median and maximum. And our fourth pair of variable is labor force and GDP. And the first visualization we did is a scatter plot for both variables. And from this scatter plot, we can see that we can see a relationship, but not a really strong one, since the slope is low and a little flat. And our second visualization is a scatter plot with a trend line. And we think that by using the line, we can see that the higher the labor force, the higher the GDP. And we think that they might not have a very strong relationship, but they do influence each other in some degree. And the next visualization we did is a box plot for labor force, and it's categorized by region. And from this box plot, we can see that Midwest has the highest labor force and South has the lowest labor force. And this is a box plot for GDP, and it's also categorized by region. And from this box plot, we can see that the South has the lowest GDP, which matches with our last box plot of South having the lowest labor force. And Northeast has the highest GDP, and we think that even though Midwest and had the highest labor force and does not have the highest GDP. The GDP for Midwest is very close to that of the Northeast. So we think that the discrepancy can be ignored. And the two box plot shows that the higher the labor force, the higher the GDP. And our next visualization is a histogram for labor force. And from this histogram, we can see that the mode for labor force is around 74 and 77. And our next histogram is for the GDP. And from this histogram, we can see that the mode is around 42,500 and the GDP of higher than 120,000 is the fewest. And here is our minimum, median, and maximum.